Hi, today I'm at the Hibulb Cultural Center, and this is a museum of sorts that shows the Tulalip Indians and their culture and history and where they are currently and everything that's happened and significant people in their tribe. It's a very interesting story. I come from Indian background, and that my grandmother was a Navajo Indian. So let's go inside and see what it's all about. This shows how women and children gathered bark to make the different products that sustain their lifestyle. Here it looks like is an example of their boats. It's a canoe. This tells us about cedar bark clothing. About the tradition of making baskets. Wow, these are pretty good. Without machines or anything, they managed to make some pretty quality artistic material. They called the cedar the giver of life because it provided so many necessities for them. And talks about how they use their cedar branches, turn them into clam baskets and other things. Stone malls, mortar and pestle, grinding stones. Here's some more cedar baskets. It explains here how cedar was like our mother. Our whole lives were encircled with cedar. And that's from Dennis Jones, who was a Tulalip master carver who lived from 1940 to 2003. Of course, this is an example of a cedar tree. This explains how the Tulalip tribes, the Indians of the area, only took what they needed from nature. They never, overfished or overutilized the land. They just lived in harmony with their surroundings. It tells about how as men came into the area and began changing the area by clear cutting, building roads and dikes and dams and all sorts of other man-made constructs, it changed a lot of the spawning grounds of the salmon, and many young salmon variety disappeared. I don't know if people know that much about many of the Indian tribes, but they're sovereign nations. They are free to govern themselves without the intrusion of the United States government on what they're doing. This is a copy of the Treaty of Point Elliott that was signed by many of the leading chiefs in the area. And what it did was it opened up millions of acres of land to migrants coming in from the rest of the country to settle here. And it helped preserve their way of life and also their fishing rights. And they can fish beyond even their land here on the reservations. So it helped preserve certain rights to them, but of course they lost a lot of the land that they were free to roam, hunt, and fish in previously to private enterprise and U.S. citizens. It talks about how they tried to make the Tulalip Indians into farmers through an allotment system, but it was difficult for them to afford the items they needed to start a farm, and also the land here wasn't always amenable to farming. It was easiest to try to do to continue to live their way of life. And because they didn't, start doing the farming and they didn't assimilate into American society, their children were often forbidden to speak the language at school, and without the easy access to their traditional fishing, hunting, and gathering grounds, their ability to sustain themselves was drastically reduced. But despite those hardships, they held on to their culture, religion, language, and bloodlines. In the summer of 1833, there was a big tsunami wave, which of course that's not predictable. There's an earthquake somewhere out in the ocean or offshore, and then it creates a big tsunami, and it came in and washed away many people that lived out on the islands or along the shores. And so many people died as a result of that, men, women, and children. And here they talk about how as more and more people came in, they had less and less area to utilize for their traditional way of life. And eventually they couldn't access some of those areas, and they had to turn to farm hands, migrant pickers, domestic help, loggers, and sawmill workers in order to survive. Which is another reason why it's good that they have their own businesses now on their land that helps them to maintain their lifestyle and also to maintain their traditions. Here's an example of what a longhouse looked like. Very large. And they used it for living in, as I explained earlier. They had many families that might live in a longhouse. They would also have ceremonies, and they used it for teaching and learning as well. Tulalip leader from the end of the 17th century and into the 19th century. They wanted me to forget my way of life and learn to be civilized and learn to be a good white person. I still don't know what a good white person is. All I know is that I learned to march, 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 and not speak my language. You got in big trouble for that. I got many whippings and confined. Picture of one of the early schools that they were brought up, the children were brought up in. And they tried to eliminate the knowledge and way of life of the Indian tribes, which was seen as barbaric. Fortunately, they preserved their way of life despite the so-called good intentions of outsiders. This talks about the competitive spirit of the youth of the Indian tribes and how they excelled in sports and how they used it kind of as an outlet to compete and to improve. And this shows an example of some of the stuff that a football player might have worn several decades ago. There's some more items made by the Indian tribe. Actually, they have exquisite craftsmanship. It's quote by Harriet Shelton Dover. I went to the public library a lot. When I was at the Tulalip Indian School, I was always getting into trouble for reading. And there's her book, Tulalip, From My Heart, an autobiographical account of a reservation community. It talks about when forced assimilation occurred, and the children were forced to go to schools, learn to assimilate into the white community. And these are examples of what you might find in a traditional classroom back then. This is something talking about the Tulalip school classrooms. And here's a canoe. That's, the craftsmanship is amazing. This canoe. You can fit, I don't know how many people in this, but a lot. And this talks about how many served in the wars. It shows some of their uniforms and guns, other equipment. Of course, we know another story about what happened with Indians involved in, for example, World War II, where you had the Navajo Indian code talkers. It just so happens that my ancestry is Navajo. My grandmother was a Navajo Indian from New Mexico, a small town there on the reservation. Many walls that show people that from the tribes that had served in the wars, all the way up to modern day wars, back to Vietnam, World War II, etc. Many died, others survived the war to live on. Inside the museum here, they built a full-scale version of a longhouse, as you can see behind me. It's very large. You can smell the cedar. It's quite a big place. This is the Tulalip Tribe's Treaty Day at Tulalip, Washington, in January 24th, 1998, celebrating the building of the second longhouse from 1968 to 1998. Other tribes represented are the Skykomish, Upper Skagit, Lumini, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, Quinault, Squamish, BC. Thanks for visiting me today and joining me on my adventure to discover the Tulalip tribes and their history and all the interesting facts about them. Similar things could be said with the tribes throughout the United States, including my Navajo tribe that my family initially came from. It's odd that when I was in there for a little while, I wasn't really expecting to feel like terribly emotional. I just thought it would be very interesting to find out about everything, and maybe it's because of my own Indian ancestry through my grandmother. There was a point in which I felt very emotional or very touched by the things that I read and saw. So it's just very important to me. But I wanted to thank all of you for joining me today, and hope that you'll come back to join me again in the future for another adventure of Big A.